The beggar comes to town. The other suitors roared out in approval. It would be good sport to order the dogs to attack this old beggar, even though he wouldn't last long. But when Telemachus stood up to face Antinous, they fell silent. The young prince's face was gloomy and his voice was cold with anger. Antinous, aren't you satisfied to live at my expense? Would you instruct me how to live as well? Leave the old man alone or you'll pay for your cruelty. Antinous was too astonished to reply. Telemachus had never dared to speak out like this. Odysseus seized the chance to provoke him further. Come then, noble lord, he said, stretching out his hand again. Will you not give me something now? Or are you too mean to spare the crumbs from another man's table? Old fool, answered Antinous, I'll give you something all right to repay your insults as they deserve. And he grabbed a footrest and hurled it at Odysseus, hitting him straight in the chest with a deafening thud. The old beggar staggered back and almost fell. Without another glance at Antinous, he shook his head sadly and walked back to his place by the main doors. Fierce anger surged up in his son's heart, but he wisely bit his lip and held back his hand. It was not yet time. The hall fell strangely quiet. The old beggar had upset the party, and no one knew just what to make of it. However, it was not long before something happened that would make everyone forget the incident. A well-known Ithacan beggar named Eris, who regarded the palace as his own territory, had just heard about his rival's presence. Now he appeared in the doorway, determined to drive the trespasser away. He gave Odysseus a sharp kick in the ribs and shouted at him so that the whole hall could hear. Get out of here, old man, or I'll kick you out. This is my patch. I've been begging here for years, and I'm treated like one of the family. I've just got as much right as you to be here as you do, replied Odysseus. Besides, there's plenty to go around. But I warn you, don't be deceived by my appearance. I've fought and beaten many better men than you in my long life. The suitors laughed gleefully at the sight of two beggars challenging each other to a fight. Now they would have some fun. They led them out to the courtyard and formed a large circle around them. Then they stripped off their rags. When Iris saw his opponent's muscular body, he stepped back trembling, but it was too late to back down. The fight didn't last long. Within seconds, Iris lay in the dust with blood streaming out of his nose. The suitors left him propped up, semi-conscious against the courtyard wall, and carried Odysseus back into the hall on their shoulders in mock triumph. Then they drank to him as champion. This must be a god among beggars, sneered Eurymachus. See how the light shines on his bald head? What a pity he's allowed himself to degenerate into a cringing parasite. If he was willing to use those strong limbs to work instead of beg, I'd pay him well. As it is, the only thing about him that really works is his fat belly. Eurymachus, replied the beggar king, you're the parasite, so bloated with conceit that you find it easier to insult others than exert yourself. I beg because I have to, and if I had the chance to swing aside or push a plow, then you'd see what I could do. But it's clear that your brain, like your smooth white hands, has never been properly used. You and Antinous think you're great lords because all of these other dogs fawn at your heels. But I warn you, Eurymachus, when the lion returns to his lair, you'll die like a dog with the rest of them. You'll run yelping from Odysseus' vengeance, and there'll be nowhere to hide. Insolent old fool, snarled Eurymachus. You must be drunk or crazy to speak to me like that. Antinous clearly had the right idea. Here's some more of his medicine. The stool was aimed straight at Odysseus' head, but he ducked beneath it, and it crashed into the wine-bearer standing behind him. The wine-bearer buckled at the knees, dropping his jar. The blood-red wine splashed across the marble floor. There was an uproar in the hall. This wretched old beggar has brought nothing but trouble, said a suitor, raising his voice above the general commotion. If he stays here any longer, we'll be at each other's throats, said another. Let's throw him out before it's too late. Then you'll have to throw me out too, said Telemachus, placing himself in front of his disguised father. It seems to me that it's all of you who have had too much to drink, not this poor old man. I suggest you go and sleep it all. After all, tomorrow is Apollo's feast day, and I'm sure you all need a good night's sleep to get back your appetites. The suitors were astonished to hear the young prince speak to them so sternly, but they were not inclined to argue. For the first time in over 3 years, they felt unsure of their ground. It had been a very disturbing day. The beggar and the queen. The suitors had departed, some to their homes in the city, and others to their beds in the palace. Odysseus and his son were at last alone in the great hall. We must move quickly now, said Odysseus. Athene has warned me that tomorrow's the day of reckoning. The suitors will be married at last, and their bride will be whipped to death. He waved an arm around the walls. Swords and spears, helmets and armor hung everywhere. Clear all of these away and hide them in one of the storerooms. If anyone asks what's happened to them, say that they were tarnished and that you sent them away to be cleaned, and hide enough weapons for ourselves in the corner by the door. When you finish, go straight to bed and try to get some sleep. I'll spend the night here in front of the fire. The walls were quickly cleared, and soon Odysseus was left alone. Meanwhile, Penelope had heard about the stranger and she longed to speak with him. Perhaps by some miracle, he brought news of her husband. When she was confident that the loathsome suitors had gone, she went down to the hall where her maids, as they did every night, were clearing up after her would-be husbands. The stranger, a curiously familiar-looking, sad-faced old beggar, was sitting in the glow of the fire. Little suspecting that this old man in rags was her long-lost husband, Penelope pulled up a chair beside him. Old stranger, you are welcome to my hearth. Please tell me who you are. Eumaeus has told me a little bit about you, and I now long to hear your story from your own lips. Odysseus stared into the fire. His wife's voice made his flesh melt. When at last he turned his face toward her, a single tear rolled down his old man's cheek. Noble queen, forgive me. I'm afraid you must think I am a pathetic old man, but when I remember all that I've lost, I can't hold back my tears. Old friend, answered Penelope with a sad smile, I'm no stranger to sorrow myself. For 20 years now, I've waited for the man that I love. Every night, I've soaked my pillow with fresh tears for over 3 years. I've been besieged by suitors who run this house and eat away my heart. Not one of them is good enough to wash my husband's feet. When they first came, I asked them to wait until I'd finished weaving a shroud for Laertes, my husband's dear father. It was a duty to which they could hardly object. Every day I'd weave, and every night I'd secretly unravel all of my work. I spun this out for over 3 years until one of my maids betrayed me. The suitors were understandably furious, and now I cannot put them off any longer. Oh, how I cursed the name of Ilium. Odysseus never wanted to go to Troy. We were deeply in love, and our son was only a few days old when the call came. Odysseus knew it would be a long war, a pointless war for petty pride, and he knew he might never return. He told me to look after his kingdom and to care for his father and mother, and if he'd not return when Telemachus came of age, that I should marry again. Old friend, tomorrow I shall make my choice, though it will break my heart. Odysseus wanted to reach out to Penelope and tell her he was home, but he knew he must not weaken now. He could not expect her to hide her feelings after so long. After 20 years, they could certainly wait one more day. Noble queen, he said, your deep sorrow matches my own. If only I brought good news, if only I could say that any day now your husband will return in glory to his home. I can't. I know too well what it's like to have my hopes raised and then cruelly dashed away. But tell me, if you can bear to speak of it, how you're going to make your choice. For I'm interested to hear your plans. Gladly, old friend, and since you have the air of a wise counselor, you can tell me whether you approve. My husband had a favorite bow that he left behind when he went to Troy. He was a great archer, and I remember how his face lit up every time he took this bow in his hands. He loved to use it and show off his skills. You know the tiny brass rings that are used to hang ceremonial axes on the wall? Well, Odysseus would line up 12 axes with their handles in the air and fire his arrows through the rings. It was a remarkable feat. Others who tried couldn't even string the bow. Tomorrow, I'll bring this bow and line up 12 axes in the hall. Whoever strings the bow and shoots an arrow through the rings will win my hand. If none succeeds, then I'll marry the first man to string the bow. Noble queen, your plan's a good one. If I were younger, I'd ask to try your husband's bow myself. Not, I need hardly add, as a suitor for your hand. I'm such an old fool as that yet. But I love archery, and I have to admit that I love to see the suitors' faces if a miserable old beggar showed them up. Penelope laughed. That would be a sight worth seeing, and if you want to, I'll make sure you get the chance. But now, old friend, you've listened to my tale of sorrow long enough. My woman will bathe you and bring you fresh clothes and bedding, and then I'll leave you to sleep. Dear Queen, for many years I've worn rags and made my bed on the hard ground. I'm an old man, and it's too late to change my habits now. Clean linens and a soft bed would be wasted on me. Besides, I wouldn't like these young women to touch my wrinkled skin, but perhaps that old woman who stands beside you might wash my aching feet. From the sadness in her eyes, I can see that she too has known great sorrow in her life. Odysseus was looking at Euryclea, his old nurse, who was now the closest companion of Penelope's sorrow. I'll do it gladly, said Euryclea, for dear Penelope's sake and for your own, and for the sake of my dear Odysseus too. For although you're worn and bowed down by age and sorrow, you look exactly as he'd have looked had he lived to be as old as you. The old nurse warmed a basin of water on the blazing fire and set it down at the beggar's feet. As she washed him, her fingers touched an old scar running up his right thigh from above the knee. She peered at it closely with her dim old eyes and then let go of his leg so suddenly that his foot dropped into the basin with a splash. Odysseus looked around in alarm, but no one was watching. Odysseus, my darling child, exclaimed Euryclea, you've come home to us at last. That scar's an old friend of mine. Remember how many times I changed the bandage on that dreadful wound? When he was still a boy, Odysseus had been wounded by a boar in the woods of Parnassus. It was a deep gash, and he had been carried back to the palace where Euryclea had taken care of the wound until it healed. Now, in the joy of recognition, the old nurse turned to Penelope to share the good news. Before she could utter a sound, Odysseus had gripped her sharply by the wrist and pulled her toward him. Dear nurse, this is Odysseus who sits before you, but don't think I come disguised for amusement's sake. This is no time for games. If the suitors discover that I'm here, they'll kill me like a dog. They've already agreed to carve up my kingdom between them, and they've spent too long here to give up now. My child, replied Euryclea, your secret's safe with me. Remember, I once nursed you at my breast, and if there's any justice in this world, then I'll live to see you drive the cruel suitors from your land and set our people free. That, old nurse, is in the hands of the gods. Let's pray that they're on my side. Euryclea continued to bathe the old beggar's feet and legs in silence. When she had finished, Penelope wished her guests good night and climbed the stairs to her lonely room in the company of her maids. Now Odysseus sat alone in the great hall, staring into the glowing heart of the fire. After all that he had been through, his greatest test was still to come, and it would come tomorrow.